Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this CSIS event. Big deal, small deal, or no deal? Possible outcomes of a Trump-Xi summit. I'm Scott Kennedy, Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS, and I am delighted to moderate today's event, which is organized by CSIS's Departments of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy and Economic Security and Technology, and features experts from the Trustee Chair, the Freeman Chair in China Studies, and the China Power Project. U.S.-China relations have been on a roller coaster ride for the last decade. But for most of that time, the roller coaster has been heading down. Now, in the first few months of the second Trump administration, the U.S. imposed tariffs on fentanyl, along with the reciprocal tariffs. All that led China to retaliate. But since May, things have calmed down. Meetings in Geneva, London, and Stockholm have produced some agreements, and it appears President Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping are preparing to meet on the sidelines of APEC, which will be held at the end of this month. And they have accepted invitations for reciprocal visits in 2026. There has been much talk about a potential deal that could be announced at APEC or at the subsequent meetings. Now, it's not 100% lock that they will meet at APEC. They're still negotiating. And the U.S. government, for all of you watching, just shut down, and that potentially could affect the president's interest in traveling to the other side of the planet. But let's begin with the assumption that they will meet. Where do U.S.-China relations stand? What is on the table? Will we get a big deal, a small deal, or no deal? And lastly, what should the U.S. be aiming for? To answer these questions, I'm joined by four of my outstanding colleagues. Let me briefly introduce them. Their full bios are on the CSIS website. And then we'll have a great discussion. We'll give them a chance to definitively answer each of these questions. Tom Christensen is the Pritzker Chair in the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department here at CSIS. He is also the James T. Shotwell Professor of International Relations and Director of the China in the World Program at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Bonny Lin is Director of CSIS's China Power Project, as well as Senior Advisor here at CSIS. Previously, she was the Acting Associate Director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program at RAND. Henrietta Levin is Senior Fellow with the Freeman Chair here in China Studies at CSIS, and she previously held senior roles in the U.S. State Department and the National Security Council, spearheading U.S. strategy and diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, with particular focus on China and its global impact, Southeast Asia, and the region's multilateral architecture. And last but not least, my colleague in the Trustee Chair, Ilaria Mazzocco, who is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Trustee Chair, and an expert on issues at the intersection between the energy transition and economic and national security. Prior to joining CSIS, she led research on China's climate and energy policy for Macro Polo, the Paulson Institute's think tank. So let's see if we can first answer the two big questions that we want to put on the table and give each of you a chance in turn. The first question is, how do you assess the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship during the first 9 months of the Trump administration? And if there is a Trump-Xi summit or meeting, what's likely to be in the deal? What would you propose being in the deal? You can take as much or little of both of those questions as you like. We'll start with Tom, then we'll go to Bonnie, Henrietta, and Ilaria. Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much, Scott. It's great to be with the team at CSIS. I'm relatively newcomer to this excellent team. I'm proud to be part of it. You ask about the trajectory of U.S.-China relations. Hard to predict. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of inconsistencies. But I've thought about it, and I think it might be a very concentrated and a more intense version of what we saw in the first Trump administration. Because as you recall, in 2018, the United States raised significant tariffs on China. China pushed back. And then over the course of 2019, there were negotiations that culminated in a deal in early 2020, the Phase 1 trade deal, which seemed to really ease tensions in the bilateral relationship. And President Trump said great things about the deal and also started to say very positive things about President Xi, even praising President Xi's initial response to the COVID crisis. The Phase 1 trade deal, as you know, had problems of its own. It probably would not have been fulfilled even in good times. But then the entire process got derailed. The U.S.-China relations easing of tensions got derailed by COVID, so we didn't really get it tested. And what we saw in the rest of 2020 was arguably the worst period in U.S.-China tensions since the Tiananmen massacre of 1989 into the early Biden administration. In 2025, what we've seen, if it is a pattern of this type, is a much more intense and fast-paced rising of tensions between the two sides. You saw very high-level tariffs, and then you saw a kind of easing of tensions, as you described, in the spring, where tariffs have been frozen in terms of escalation, but at a very high level of over 50% on the U.S. side. And I think the Trump administration this year was somewhat surprised by the intensity of Beijing's pushback, both in terms of resolve and in terms of the tools that Beijing could bring to bear in response to the U.S. tariffs. So maybe now, as we approach APEC in Korea in the fall, it's looking like late 2019 and the lead up to the Phase 1 trade agreement, and maybe they'll be negotiating various things. And I try to think about what American officials are saying to their Chinese counterparts in preparation for the meeting, and I would expect the United States to be emphasizing the need for more Chinese restrictions on export of fentanyl precursors. About 20% of the tariffs are constituted by that issue in the American foreign policy statements. I expect the United States to push for more ready exports from China of rare earths and rare earth magnets. And I expect the United States to push for China to restore the imports of various U.S. products, especially in the agricultural sector, like soybeans. There's always consular issues involved in these things, so I expect the United States to complain about detained Americans and about Americans who can't get exit visas out of China. And there's a perennial issue that doesn't get in the press very often, and that is that there are many hundreds of Chinese citizens here illegally, and China has been reluctant to take them back to China, and that will probably come up as well. And I expect the United States to push back on Chinese complaints about U.S. policy in the region by emphasizing the negative aspects of PRC coercion against Taiwan, the Philippines, and Japan. I think that's bound to happen. For China, I expect them to seek reductions in U.S. tariffs overall. They're already very high, and they could be higher. Reductions of U.S. export restrictions on semiconductors, high-end semiconductors, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And a pause and perhaps a reversal in the trend of listing more and more Chinese entities on the Commerce Department's entities list, making it basically impossible for U.S. firms or institutions to deal with those Chinese entities without government permission, which is unlikely to be forthcoming. For China, I expect them also to push for things outside the economic realm. And this is one of my sources of concern. I expect President Xi will want the United States to move beyond its traditional one China policy on Taiwan, to ask for various things related to Taiwan, a move from the traditional position of non-support for Taiwan independence, perhaps for a request for the United States to say it opposes Taiwan independence, or maybe even a request that the United States say that it supports peaceful unification between the PRC and Taiwan. He might request a cessation of U.S. arms sales or security cooperation with Taiwan. And I think any of these, if they were adopted by the United States, would be devastating to morale in Taiwan and very damaging to Taiwan's security. So you'd asked whether we see a grand bargain and whether one should happen. I don't think a grand bargain that would be possible to reach would be in the U.S. interest, so I'm not really looking forward to seeing one. On high-end semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, I see these as national security measures designed to slow PLA modernization. I don't see them as trade bargaining chips, and I hope they're not treated as such. And I think the on-again, off-again treatment of the NVIDIA H20 chip this year has clouded the distinctions in those categories to some degree. But I hope that we keep our existing restrictions in place and do not bargain them away on other trade issues. And while we always should be listening to Beijing's concerns about cross-strait relations, about domestic politics in Taiwan, about their concerns about U.S. policy towards Taiwan, I don't think we should be negotiating with Beijing about the security relationship with Taiwan, and we certainly shouldn't be negotiating, in my opinion, with Beijing about the future of the relationship between Taiwan and the PRC. So could we have a deal that's not a grand bargain? Yeah, I think we could. I think I can imagine progress on fentanyl. And again, 20% of the tariffs are on fentanyl. I could imagine some kind of deal in which China agrees to put greater restrictions and enforce those restrictions on fentanyl. I could even imagine some progress on purchases of soybeans and reduction of tariffs on other categories. But I think the progress is likely to be modest. I think that there are big outstanding problems that remain and are unlikely to be settled in a smaller deal. And one of them is China's concern about the U.S. declaration that it will be putting 40% tariffs on trans-shipped goods through third countries. And China produces a lot of products and sells a lot of parts into products that are produced in third countries and exported to the United States. And I think that's going to be an ongoing sore point for China. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of the U.S. concerns about the Chinese economy have to do with how they do business at home. And I don't think the Chinese side is going to want to negotiate on those issues. And then finally, I'll just close with this. In 2020, what really blew up the warming of relations in January 2020 was the COVID crisis, something outside the negotiating space. And I can imagine issues outside the negotiating space blowing up any deal that's reached in late 2025 or early 2026. And one of them is if President Trump remains frustrated with President Putin over Ukraine and really wants to put pressure on Russia in the economic sphere. He's already raised tariffs on India for purchasing Russian energy. If he applied those to China, those types of tariffs on China, that would blow up the economic deal for reasons outside of the economic negotiations. It would be a national security decision to put pressure on Russia because China would almost certainly retaliate to those tariffs placed on China over Russia, the secondary sanctions. And another issue that keeps coming to my mind is that China's had a long-term relationship with Iran. The Iranian military is very weak right now. The Iranian military is going to be turning to outside actors to help rebuild its military, its air defenses and other things, its missiles. And I wouldn't be surprised if China participated in the process of strengthening the Iranian military. I don't think they would publicize this, but if the Iranian military is as penetrated by foreign intelligence as it seems to be, I think it may become disclosed that China is doing this, and this could lead to tariffs by the Trump administration. That would scrap the economic negotiations. So just like COVID blew up the deal in January 2020, I could see these other issues blowing up a deal that might be reached in the negotiations. But I could imagine certain compromises by both sides that maybe lowers the overall economic tension between the two actors for a period of time. And I'll close with that. Thanks for asking me to come today, and thanks for including me in this great group.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. So it sounds like you see a lot of issues on the table. The likelihood of a grand bargain seems low, which probably you're happy with. But even if we get to a smaller deal, there's a lot of ways that things could go sideways, whether it's with those issues or issues that haven't been raised that could suddenly come up. Let's turn to Bonny Lin and get your thoughts now on the relationship and things as we head into a potential meeting.
Great. Thank you, Scott. It's always hard to follow Tom. And I largely agree with the breadth of issues that Tom covered. So maybe I'll try to emphasize what I see as first several large trends in U.S.-China relations. And then I'll talk a little bit more about my thoughts on what we're looking for in a deal or what could be possible. And much of this aligns with what Tom mentioned. I think a major trend I'm seeing right now in the first 10 months under Trump 2.0 is a prioritization of economic negotiation deals and less high-level emphasis on diplomatic or security defense issues or areas of friction within the relationship. I think it's quite telling last week that Ambassador Perdue characterized the Trump team as, quote, trying to buy some time, lower the temperature, and find a way to coexist with China while standing up for American farmers, right? Nowhere in his discussion were any of the contentious security or diplomatic issues that were discussed. And if you look at the calls, what we can at least gather from the readouts of calls between President Trump and President Xi, the emphasis really has been on economic issues. Though we did see President Trump raise Ukraine and Russia to Xi once, and Xi raised Taiwan. I think we can see that a lot of these other issues are discussed at lower levels, but they're not being discussed at the presidential level. But of course, a telephone call is very different from an in-person meeting, and it's possible that a range of issues could be covered in an in-person meeting versus a telephone call. What I would also say is on the defense side is what we saw Secretary Hegseth recently say to Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun during their September call, in which he affirmed that the United States does not see conflict with China, nor is it pursuing regime change or strangulation of the PRC. As my colleague Chad Spragia said, who was the DASD for China during the first Trump administration, it's quite unusual for a U.S. defense leader to say this publicly, and it signals a desire among the Trump team for at least some stability on the security defense side. But again, that does not mean that the United States is less prepared or doing less on security front. If anything, with the Department of War, they're sharpening their focus on being ready to fight China over Taiwan. The second trend I'm seeing in the last couple of months or in this Trump 2.0 is, of course, more decoupling. Tom has listed a number of ways that we're already seeing this. For example, of course, the tariffs are hurting trade. We're also seeing U.S. adding more Chinese entities to the entity list, Chinese subsidiaries to entity list, and of course, more to the military end user list. Scott, you may have the most up-to-date data on this, but my understanding is that Chinese exports to the United States is down at least 15% this year, and that's likely to continue to decrease over the year. The third major trend I'm seeing in the first 9 to 10 months of this administration is less cooperation or coordination with China internationally. So I will ask my team to go back and look at all the meetings that occurred during the first 9 months of the Trump 1.0 and the first 9 months of the Biden administration. And in general, we're seeing less high-level non-economic dialogue right now in 2025 between the two sides than compared to the first 9 months in the prior administrations. In fact, in 2017, during Trump 1.0, we saw over 30 meetings between senior Trump officials and Chinese officials. And these meetings were used to discuss a range of issues where we saw U.S. and Chinese interlocutors coordinating or at least trying to cooperate with each other, including on North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. In 2021, similarly, we saw some degree of both sides trying to work together on climate change in Afghanistan. Now in Trump 2.0, I'm hard-pressed to see one major issue that we are actually trying to work with China on. I think even on Russia-Ukraine, it's more of putting pressure on China and threatening sanctions. It's not actually trying to work with China on Ukraine, or we believe that we can actually work with China on Russia and Ukraine. Let me now turn to what might be part of a deal or no deal between the United States. I very much agree with Tom that there are lots of smaller issues that maybe could be packaged together to form a large deal, but I don't see a deal of the same scale as, for example, the phase one deal in 2020. And I think Tom made a good point. China did not carry through with its purchasing of the phase one deals. And I think when they reassess what happened, they are likely also to think that their attempt to buy a better U.S.-China relations failed. And I think China will be very reluctant to try that again in 2025, particularly under a more competitive U.S.-China environment. We also have been seeing news reporting about China offering a massive investment in the United States in exchange for U.S. loosening of scrutiny of PRC investment in the U.S., tariff breakout less tariffs on any Chinese factories in the U.S. But some of that speculation, I think, does not take into account that any of these types of agreements on the U.S. end could be viewed as the Trump administration conceding Chinese control over the U.S. economy. And we're already seeing a number of leading Republicans and Democrats push back against that. I very much agree with Tom that there is probably a Chinese desire to see the United States have some type of policy declaration change vis-a-vis Taiwan. I guess I don't see that right now in terms of appetite within the Trump administration. And I think the Trump administration should understand that any change in our Taiwan policy has implications beyond just Taiwan. It has implications for Japan, for the Philippines, for many of our allies and partners there, and also has implications if those changes could cause China to become more aggressive against Taiwan. That could decrease regional stability and also disrupt regional and global trade. The one item I will add to Tom's long list of things that we probably could negotiate or discuss with China is the Boeing deal, right? The possibility that China might buy 500 Boeing jets. I think that and maybe soybeans are probably things that are probably top of mind on the U.S. side. Let me close up by just saying that, Scott, you mentioned the reciprocal possibility of a visit to China and for Xi also to come to the United States in 2026. Personally, I believe the chance of the two of them meeting at APEC is more likely than a reciprocal visit in 2026. I think if we were to have a Trump visit to China or Xi visit to the United States, we really need a big deal. And I don't see that appearing. I see at least the U.S. side throwing out the possibility of a Trump visit in 2026 to China to encourage China to think about what could be put on the table. But I just don't see how President Trump can say he has a large enough win to go to China in 2026. I'll wrap it up here. Thank you.
Bonnie, that's really terrific. You added a lot, particularly the helpful conclusion that a lot is the way the focus of the relationship has shifted and much more intensely on economics, and the lack of broader level engagement across the administration with the Chinese, but the same broader conclusion that the chances of a big deal are relatively low, and even perhaps meetings. Henrietta, you served just recently in the U.S. government and saw a lot of these things up close, and now you've had a chance to catch up on your sleep, to think about these from outside the U.S. government perspective here at CSIS. How do you look at the relationship and the prospects for a meeting?
Great, and can confirm sleeping is great time. So I of course, have very little to add on top of the great insights from Tom and Bonnie, but maybe I'll just start by looking at how the Chinese side of the equation might be looking at the U.S.-China relationship going into this meeting. And it does seem like this is a relationship in which China increasingly feels like they do have the upper hand. I think we should expect President Xi to be walking into his meeting with President Trump with an exceptional amount of confidence. And we can argue about the degree to which that reflects a good reading of reality, but he clearly does have that confidence. And I think Beijing had assumed going into this year that it would have the upper hand in a trade war with President Trump. I think they predicted that China's economic and political system could better withstand the pain of significant trade disruptions than their American analogs could. And I think they feel like they've been proven right. They feel like they have successfully leveraged supply chain choke points, including with respect to rare earths, to get the U.S. to back down, seek a rapid rapprochement from the heights of bilateral tensions earlier this spring. I think Beijing also feels they have been able to very effectively target economic pain within the United States at constituencies important to President Trump from a political perspective. We've seen that play out with China's decision to not purchase American soybeans in this season, at least so far. And I think Chinese officials also believe that Trump wants this meeting so much that he wants to build a relationship with Xi, that he wants to work out challenges in the relationship man to man, as it were. that I think China feels that gives them even further leverage within the US-China relationship. And I should acknowledge that, over the past few months, Trump has been much more, I think, restrained in his own signaling on that file. But earlier in the year, he was so exuberant in seeking a meeting and conversations with Xi that I think that has stuck in the collective mind in Beijing as yet another point of leverage. And I think they feel like that has been wielded successfully as well to secure at least initial concessions on really important strategic issues, including Taiwan and export controls related to high-end technology. And my colleagues have already spoken to some of that. It's worth noting that China also feels like it's in a very strong position in its own region, in its neighborhood. Just hosted a very large Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. It feels like it's made a lot of progress in, pulling India away from the United States and towards Beijing. And I think that all matters as well as to how the Chinese side of the relationship looks at the United States at this time. And so all of that comes together to mean, at least that in my view, I think I would agree with my colleagues that this is not a moment for a big deal between the United States and China, or at least not a good one. I can't imagine President Xi offering meaningful concessions without getting far more in return. And I hope that Washington will be wary of, the limited economic gestures like what Tom described, for example, purchases of agricultural products that, first of all, may not be fulfilled even if the commitment is made, but secondly, really are not commensurate with anything that would merit a strategic concession on the U.S. side. And it does seem like Beijing is trying to create those linkages between the economic wins, the tactical wins that seem to be on the top of Trump's mind, and more traditional American national security interests. And so while I do think that it's always good for the leaders of the United States and China to talk, and I do think it's achievable to try and land at least further steps of mutual de-escalation in the relationship. For example, the very, very high tariff rates from this spring are only paused until mid-November, and I think about a little bit more than a week after the two leaders may meet at APEC. And so you could imagine a decision to make those pauses on very high tariff rates, if not permanent, at least more enduring. But I hope that that does not serve as the foundation for a broader deal, which in this environment would almost definitionally favor Beijing. And I just want to also briefly build on Bonnie's point about the role of U.S. alliances in any U.S.-China leader level conversation. Because, of course, when Trump and Xi meet, this isn't just about the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. It's going to be watched so closely by all of the U.S. allies in the region. And I think if allies see that Washington is willing to compromise on its own national interest to achieve détente with Beijing, even if it's not a national interest that speaks immediately to the priorities of that ally, just being willing to compromise on important things means that those allies can hardly expect the U.S. to push back on Chinese aggression to defend the national interest of allies. And that can start to create a quite dangerous domino effect. If the U.S. strikes a bad deal with Beijing, that's not just one bad deal that you're getting. One bad deal opens the door to countless others as allies have to think about how to manage their own risk in the region and when it comes to their own bilateral partnership with Beijing. So I'll just stop with one last thought, and that would be a hope that the United States does not, whatever happens in this meeting, that we don't allow China to define the meeting to our allies. It'll be incredibly important for U.S. officials to fan out across the region as soon as this meeting happens, to tell our partners what happened, to tell our side of the story, to make clear, hopefully, that we stood by not only our own interests, but those of our allies over the course of the conversation, because China's going to be doing exactly the same thing and trying to seize the narrative in the region. And I'll stop there.
Henrietta, thank you very much for sharing your additional anxieties and worries about what could be agreed upon and the implications not only for the bilateral relationship, but for U.S. allies as well. Ilaria, welcome your thoughts on the relationship and potential meeting.
Yes, thank you, Scott. There's not a lot left to say after our excellent colleagues have really, I think, covered a lot of ground. I'll start by saying that I agree with Henrietta that this is a moment in which China is quite confident in its relations, I think, not just with the United States, but other countries as well. I think you can see this in the shift in tone with the European Union, for example, and I think also increasing sort of soft power of China in sort of emerging markets as well. So I think this, generally speaking, this is a fairly confident China that feels that it has a really big new variable in its relations with the United States, which is these rare earth export controls, which I think are really seen in Beijing as a really, really strong weapon. And something that I think maybe is a little different from the first Trump administration. So I think, this is a moment when, there's been a ceasefire. This could end very rapidly. Things could go really poorly. And then we would see again whether, the U.S. and China's weapons, trade weapons, export control weapons could be deployed again. So I think it's still a very, very fragile moment. I think in a way, the summer has lulled many into thinking that relations are relatively stable, but this could actually deteriorate very, very quickly, even though for now, negotiators on both sides seem to be very positive that there can be some sort of deal. I agree as well that, it seems hard to envision a grand bargain, in part because we also don't have a very clear vision of what the U.S. would be asking for. I think with this administration, the sort of, traditional big goals that the U.S. has pressed on, rebalancing of the Chinese economy really don't seem as significant or as important. And so, we have these smaller, more discrete goals, of course, very important, like fentanyl, for example, but hardly sort of structural issues. And so I think, we could definitely see a deal that maybe could even be a good deal on fentanyl, for example, or rare earths or imports. But I think, these are really sort of a short-term gap, stopgap solution, not really something that really solves the big issues that continue to come up in the relationship. So I think that's certainly true. I want to say a word about investment in the U.S. because I think in a way it's been the most interesting thing. It's something that there's been whispers and gossip about in Washington and Beijing, I think, for months and months. It's quite interesting that now we finally have some reporting that China is maybe dangling some offers to the U.S. or making some sort of promise, which is actually in line with what many U.S. allies have committed to. I think it even raises the question of just how many billions and trillions of dollars of foreign direct investment the U.S. can absorb in such a short period of time, if all of these come to fruition and are actually, actually sort of come through. But I think beyond that, it comes into direct conflict with what the Trump administration's stated policy was earlier this year, right? The America First investment policy is extremely negative on Chinese investment. I think it names several sectors, and then finally includes all other strategic sectors as well, right? So I think it makes it very hard to envision exactly what sectors would be acceptable. Now, of course, part of this negotiation seems to be sort of dropping some of those restrictions and embracing much more Chinese investment. But I think a lot more thought would be needed on exactly how this would be structured, right? Are we talking about joint ventures, licensing? And I think, also what sectors would actually be valuable for the United States to receive Chinese investment? Under the Biden administration, it was pretty straightforward that something like batteries, right? Things that would actually sort of be where China has a very strong lead technologically, and they're sort of aligned with the administration's goals on the energy transition. And, batteries also have other applications, including military applications, right? There could be something there, but batteries have not really been a big priority for the Trump administration. And in fact, if you look at the existing agreements with Chinese companies and Chinese investments in the U.S., the GOP has been extraordinarily critical of these. And I think that's reflected also in Molnar's remarks that have been quite critical of a potential deal on investment. So I still think there's actually quite a lot of issues, like a whole broad set of issues. When we talk about investment, it's very vague, but exactly investment in what, right? Are we talking about furniture? Are we talking about biotech, actually, biotech seems very difficult to achieve. Furniture seems like maybe it gets a few jobs, but doesn't really, is that the type of manufacturing that we're aiming for here? So I think there's still a lot of questions there on how feasible this is and how much would this actually bring to the United States that is of strategic value, as opposed to, for example, the types of investments that partners such as Japan or the European Union could bring. So I think, there's still a lot of issues there. But I think, one thing for sure that I'll be looking for is to see more details on the TikTok deal, which seems to be coming along. And I think that would probably, most of us are probably expecting that will be one of the main deals that would be announced in this next upcoming meeting. And I think, getting a better sense of whether or not this actually is advantageous to the United States will probably be a signpost for other deals to come.
Well, that's super helpful. Thank you, Ilaria. Let me make one little observation about economics and then ask a couple questions to all of you to follow up your excellent overviews about the relationship and a potential meeting. On the economics, I would agree. It's funny, we call this a ceasefire right now, but the U.S. still has overall 55% tariffs on China. That's like crazy high. I mean, it should be 3%. That's like U.S. MFN tariff rate. So we're way above that, and in some areas even further. And that's why, as Bonnie said correctly, bilateral trade has dropped a lot. Now, some of that has gone to others and through transshipments and stuff. But when you've got 55% tariffs, you're basically you're strangleholding economic ties in addition to all these other things. So this is a ceasefire in which one side has their head around the other's neck, the other's got the arm around the other's ankle and twisting really hard. It's like a World Wrestling Federation ceasefire, if any. Second, let me ask a couple questions. The first one is I've had a hard time discerning what the Trump administration's China policy is. And I'm hoping that the four of you have a better sense of what that is, whether you squint or whether it's something people you've talked to. What is the administration's China policy if you were going to try and figure out how to, on their behalf, or articulate it? Is it a Kissingerian realist policy in which values are replaced by focus on hard interests and you try to match commitments to capabilities? Is it that kind of thing, or is it something else? And I guess the second thing I'm curious about, everybody's quite concerned about negotiations and what the U.S. could potentially give away. Well, I know during the Biden administration, during its 4 years most recently, negotiated all of 0 times with China about these kinds of things. I think the Biden administration's view was, if we negotiate on these hard choices, we won't get anywhere. It'll be a waste of time. They won't engage us the way they had in the past, or what the Trump administration during its first administration got. And so instead, we're going to focus on strengthening at home, expanding our relationship, improving our relations with our allies, and then we'll have conversations with China, not negotiations. So are you all just against negotiations? We got the two biggest, most powerful countries in the world. Shouldn't we be negotiating about something rather than just having conversations? And what should we be negotiating about if we're not going to be negotiating about fentanyl or TikTok or Taiwan? It just seems odd that we just can't negotiate with China because we're afraid we're going to give away the store. So who would like to start and pick up some of those crazy thoughts that I've thrown on the table? Henrietta.
I'm mostly starting so that I can answer the second question and not the first one, because I'm sure everyone else will have great insights into what the single coherent China strategy is of this administration. But I think you bring up a really important point of, the the Biden's maybe aversion to at least even like conceptualizing a big negotiated deal with China. And so I think it's worth parsing out the difference between, in the context of the US-China relationship, a deal and a decision. And so remember, we were also the channels of communication people during the Biden administration. You know, we want to have open channels, candid, constructive communication, address misunderstanding, that kind of thing. And so most of that was to avoid downside risk. I think some of the most significant conversations, especially at the leader level, were about, not going to war by accident, more or less. But there were actually incremental gains on the cooperative agenda as well, but they weren't deals, they were decisions. And they weren't really negotiations. They were more of the product of these talks, these conversations that you referenced. And I think some of the ones that received were maybe most significant came out of the Woodside Summit at another APEC between Biden and Xi, where there was a decision on both sides to resume cooperation on counter-narcotics and address the flow of fentanyl precursor chemicals from China to the US, also a decision to resume military-to-military communication. And those are real decisions agreed at the highest level on both sides. And they were implemented, and you did see kind of a resumption of talks between the two militaries. Can't say how useful those talks were, but they happened. And, not nearly enough from China on fentanyl, but they did take steps. And I actually think it would have been much more difficult to get to that place, to get to those agreements that did very slowly but meaningfully advance the U.S. interest if those decisions were contextualized within a broader, big negotiated deal, because then you could just get dragged down between all of the linkages that Beijing would try and create between unrelated issues that are not the U.S. priority. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So decisions, not deals. Others who want to weigh in on the negotiation question or helping us gain some clarity about the logic behind American policy?
Well, Scott, I was trying to say that I didn't want to see a grand bargain because I think China would make demands in the grand bargain that are not in the U.S. interest. So if we reached a grand bargain, I'd be afraid we gave away too much. Or even putting certain things on the table, I think, is a mistake. So I don't think we should be talking to them about those issues related to Taiwan. And I agree with Bonnie and Henrietta that one of the reasons we don't want to do that is the signal it sends to third countries, allies, and partners in the region and around the world about our willingness to compromise on longstanding security policies. But I do think, just the fentanyl issue alone, Scott, it's 20% of that 55%. And I don't see any real reason why we can't get greater cooperation from China on that issue than we have. I think it's very frustrating to Americans, and I'll just say this, it's a live stream event, very frustrating to Americans when it appears that Chinese counterparts are using fentanyl as a negotiating lever in the first place. The idea that, we would love to cooperate with you on the export of these precursors that are being used by drug cartels to produce poisons that kill tens of thousands of Americans every year, but you're not cooperating with us on tariffs. So how do you expect us to cooperate with you on this? It seems like the kind of issue that it should be in China's own national interest, regardless of the details of tariff negotiations, to reduce. But it has the great benefit in this case of addressing 20% of the tariffs, which are about fentanyl. So I don't see why we can't make progress on that issue and reduce the tariffs for that reason. And then there are other issues like soybeans. China has a real incentive to buy soybeans from around the world. There's no reason why they shouldn't consume American ones. And as you said, the tariff levels, it's a ceasefire, but it's a ceasefire at a very high level that's not particularly good for the U.S. economy to have 55% tariffs on China. So I can see ways to reduce the tariff levels. Again, but the problem that I see is we're not going to get at some of the core issues involved in our relationship. The United States, across administrations, going back, I served in the Bush administration, we were concerned about things that China was doing in its economy at home that was distorting its economic profile abroad. And a lot of our economic dialogues were based on those types of factors. And I don't see much stomach in China for discussing with Americans how they should structure their domestic economy, particularly under President Xi. When I was in the government as President Hu, We talked about all these things with them, but I think under President Xi, the idea is we're not going to allow foreigners to tell us what to do domestically, how to create more consumption, et cetera. So I don't see a lot of progress there. And I don't think we should be negotiating on the semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And my sense on that is that we put those measures in place because we believe that they will fuel future AI innovations that will have military applications. And for a very long time, the United States has had a list of technologies, as you know, that we don't sell to China for that reason. So when I was in the government, I remember it was equipment that helped you build turbofan jet engines. We just wouldn't sell that to China. It was big commercial reasons to do so, but we thought it had clearly had too many military applications, so we wouldn't sell them. And we didn't negotiate over it. We didn't say if you act nicer to Taiwan, we will sell you this equipment. It just wasn't on the table. It wasn't. We'd listen to their complaints and we'd tell them we're not going to do it. Right. And I think that the chips should be in that category. If they're not in that category, if we determine that it doesn't slow down PLA modernization, we probably have strong economic incentives ourselves to sell that stuff to China because we're really good at that. And it's a comparative advantage of ours. But I still think it's related to military and it shouldn't be on the table. And I'm fairly certain it will be put on the table because I hear just in track 2 discussions that it's on the table from the Chinese perspective. And I don't think it should be. So that makes me nervous. I don't know how much progress can be made. And as I said earlier, I can see because of our strategic differences around the world with China that various issues that are unrelated to pure economic negotiations can get in the way of any progress we make in those economic negotiations. If, as has been demonstrated, the Trump administration's favorite tool of pressure on a government is to raise tariffs. So if we're upset with China over Russia, if we're upset with China over Iran, if we're upset with China in its behavior towards the Philippines, towards Japan or other allies and partners, the tool of tariffs seems to be a favorite tool. So if you were asking me, will a tariff negotiation hold and will we return to higher tariffs later, I'd have to say I'd need to be convinced not only that the negotiations themselves and economics will produce fruit, but that other aspects of our competitive relationship with China will not arise that scrap any economic agreement to lower tariffs. Because I know that if we raise tariffs, they will retaliate. And we've seen that over and over.
Yes, very helpful. Bonnie, you wanted to weigh in on these.
Sure, Scott. I'll try to jump in on at least my sense of the Trump's China policy. So I think my sense is Trump's China policy is less focused on China and more focused on the United States. I don't want to sound crude by saying it's more America first. So I've heard it explained to me that one of the key priorities for U.S. policy towards China is to make sure that no decision made by Beijing can be of life or death consequence for the United States. And that is a different way of framing thinking about China than, for example, managing competition, which we saw under the Biden term, or winning the competition, which we saw Matt Pottinger trying to push. So it's not so much about winning across the board, nor is it about managing Beijing, but it's about what are U.S. interests at stake and in what areas we need to protect the United States by being less dependent on China, and what areas the United States still needs to maintain our lead. And with respect to that, my sense is that we, of course, seek to avoid war with China. I think it's pretty clear from the Trump team that we still need to win the technological race with China. And also within the Trump team, we're seeing a lot of push to be less dependent on China across the board economically, right? So for supply chains, for energy, food security. And of course, we also talked about earlier, we're not dependent on China for managing international affairs, right? I do see in the Trump's China policy a desire to continue to work with our allies and partners. But I think that will be of a different scope and scale than what we saw during the Biden term, because there's less of there may be certain areas where the Trump team does not view the need to work with our allied partners as much in countering China if it doesn't directly relate to American interests. And of course, welcome my colleagues to jump in. Again, I think we're still seeing Trump's China policy being formed, and also it could evolve over time too.
Yeah, can I just say something about ideology? I want to hear what Ilaria has to say, and I just wanted to add something to what Bonnie said quickly, which is, I think the most ideological policy we've had recently towards China was in 2020, in the first Trump term, after COVID pandemic started. We had U.S. officials calling into question the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party regime at home. Matt Pottinger's very impressive but very different speech on May 4th of 2020, and Secretary Pompeo painting the entire relationship in Cold War terms, saying, basically the planet is not big enough for these two types of systems, and China poses a threat to democracy around the world. That was a very ideological approach. I don't see that in the current administration. I just wanted to point that I don't see that kind of ideological edge at all. I agree with Bonnie's description, and I think that's a big change. And I would say that the Biden administration was somewhere in the middle. It did talk about authoritarianism versus democracy in a traditional American ideological sense, but I don't think it put a tremendous amount of energy in that. And there was a guarantee as part of those guardrails that Henrietta laid out so well in the Biden administration that said, we're not trying to change your regime. We can live with your regime. That's not really the issue. We just don't want to fight unnecessarily. So I think that we've walked pretty far away from 2020. I think we're further away from it than we were in the Biden administration. And you had that rather extraordinary discussion that Henrietta talked about Bonnie talked about between Secretary Hegseth and Defense Minister Dong Jun, saying, we're not coming after you. We don't want to fight you. We don't want to contain you, and we don't want to change your regime. We just want to avoid unnecessary conflict. That's a real signal. I don't know how deeply that's held across the administration, but it signals something. Anyway, I'll stop talking because I want to hear what Ilaria has to say.
Yes, Ilaria.
I think I was going to say one thing to think about in identifying sort of what the China policy is under this administration is that I think in a way gets muddled or gets complicated by the fact that the administration has had such an ambitious, I would say even radical approach to the rest of the world when it comes to economic policy, right? So sort of rewriting the rules of the economic trading order, right? That complicates significantly U.S.-China relations as well. And I think it makes it difficult to then identify or isolate what is a China-specific policy and what is a policy towards any country that has a trade surplus with the United States. Right. In some ways, we've seen China sort of end up in the same bucket with countries that the United States has far more positive or close relationships with on a security front. Right. I would put India in that category, for example. Right. And so I think that has made it very difficult for China analysts like us to just then identify this is a very specific China policy, and this is a broader policy on like trade or reducing just U.S. dependencies globally on trade, right? I think there's, certainly I agree with Bonnie that this administration is very much focused on reducing dependencies on China, but it seems also very interested in reducing dependencies on allies as well, right? So I think that's quite different. And I think the approach to de-risking has also been quite different because the real risk there is that when you put tariffs on countries where supply chains have been shifting, you could disincentivize that. And the perverse effect is that more supply chains stay in China. So I think, this has been what I think, to me, has complicated my understanding of what exactly the China policy is in all of this. I'll say I think I generally agree with Tom on when it comes to that there can be some positive smaller deals. I think there should be negotiations on fentanyl. I actually think even on the investment front, there could be some positive outcomes for the United States. I was casting some doubt on whether $1 trillion investment was even possible, but I think that doesn't mean, there certainly are some areas where Chinese companies have a lot to offer, and I think there could be ways of mitigating the risk there, right? Of course, this would require a lot of thinking, a lot of strategy, and I think it would be really politically difficult for the Trump administration, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a scenario where there could be a positive outcome there. So I think, there's definitely potential for some good, smaller deals. I think the grand bargain strategy, I agree, it has a lot of pitfalls, but I guess we'll find out maybe we'll need to have another event, Scott.
Yes. Well, if there is a meeting and there are results and they are communicated either by the Chinese or, as Henrietta suggests, by the U.S. government, we will need to have another event, or at least we'll need to write. The kind of critiques that I have heard in our program and also outside of the program about the Trump administration's China policy typically fall into two kinds of camps. One is sort of a hawkish critique. That is, they're giving away the store. They're going to make concessions on Taiwan or on semiconductors and export controls or things like that. That we shouldn't make those kind of compromises no matter what, or they have big consequences. The other is regarding the international order, the rules-based order that the U.S. had this architecture post World War II that was in the U.S. interests. It helped bind the relationship with our allies. It brought prosperity. And the Trump administration is violating both of those things. It's hawkish in some areas, but quite unhawkish in others. And obviously, it's taking an axe to the international order, the Bretton Woods system, et cetera. And I think that's why people say, well, either one or the other is why Beijing seems to be pretty darn confident going in. And if there isn't a deal, I think that it's quite possible that would be okay with Beijing, that there isn't a deal. And as long as things don't tip over in the direction that Tom warned about because of Russia or Iran or something like that. So I was curious, how happy do you think China is to just have this kind of go along in this direction, even if there is no agreement, if tariffs are not reduced, if export controls are not restrained, if the Trump administration doesn't make any new commitments related to Taiwan? Second question, American governance, American economy, and how that's having an effect on China policy. We've got DOGE. I think we've seen about 300,000 federal workers who are not in the workforce any longer, huge restructuring at the State Department, much smaller NSC, very different interagency process, and I'll use process in quote marks there. We have a very different approach toward managing the economy domestically, tax policy. We're in a shutdown. How does that stuff affect day-to-day or even big picture making China policy? So I'll leave those two out there as the final things for you all to kind of react to. Maybe I'll start with Bonnie and Ilaria, and then Henrietta and Tom to finish us up.
Sure. I'll just weigh in really quickly on your first question. Is Beijing happy with sort of progressing as is without a deal, or does Beijing want a deal? I think Beijing probably wants some deal, and Beijing probably wants President Trump to go to China. But at the same time, given all of its lessons learned from the phase one deal, in terms of how much you can actually buy good U.S.-China relations and all the other factors that could come on top of that to, as Tom was talking about, derail the relationship, I think Beijing is probably very cautious. But I do think my sense is our Chinese colleagues probably do believe that it's better for President Trump to meet with President Xi in person, and that if they look at the Trump administration, there's still concern among Chinese officials that there are a lot of hawks within the Trump administration. But President Trump himself can still keep the lid on U.S.-China relations going in too much of a hawkish direction if President Xi can have a relationship with President Trump. And I think China is also well aware that once you step outside of who is in the Trump administration, the large consensus within DC is towards heightened competition with China. So I'll wrap up there.
Thank you. Ilaria.
I think China would probably prefer to have some level of stability, right? I think if this were not a situation where we have a ticking clock where tariffs could go up again, it might be acceptable for this to stay, but I think, the government would much rather have some sort of deal, even if it's not like the full deal that gets them everything they want, but something that gives them some level of sort of stability. I mean, as we know, the trade war with the United States has not broken the Chinese economy, but the Chinese economy has a lot of issues. And so it's not helpful to have this on top of everything else, right? So I think, they would certainly much prefer to have 30% tariffs, for example, compared to 55, and certainly compared to 125, right? So I think, on the whole, there are still some incentives on their part to get some sort of deal. And I think, as Bonnie said, right, they probably would like to have some sort of grand gesture, as a state visit of some sort. And I'll just say, I think it's true that there is a lot of disruption in the U.S. There's been a lot of change in the U.S. government, and I think that must have at some level some impact, right? I think a lot of processes have changed as well. And so I think, that's meant also rebuilding sort of the channels for diplomacy. It seems like now we have some sort of process, but that took a while as well. So I think, that certainly affected how relations evolved over the past year. Stop there.
Henrietta?
Sure. In terms of whether China's happy without a deal, I think they would prefer one. I agree with Ilaria. They're looking for at least a tactical level of stability in the relationship. I think they feel they can secure that on most favorable terms through a deal if one can be reached, in part because of what the administration has already demonstrated they're willing to be flexible on. But I think that to some degree, the pace of meetings at the leader level that have now been previewed over the course of the next few months will play a similar function in terms of bringing tactical stability to the relationship. If it is true that Trump is planning to go to China and that she's planning to come to the U.S., then this isn't just about the APEC summit. This is really about a period of time that will be defined by periodic leader-level interactions between the two presidents. And if China is able to be successful in convincing President Trump that the best way to ensure those meetings are good, however Trump defines that, is by holding back on more assertive competitive actions vis-a-vis China, whether that's related to technology, Taiwan, Indo-Pacific alliances, then China could actually get quite a lot out of just leveraging this meeting structure that would look like the big deal that all of us have said we're so concerned about, even if there is no deal, kind of like a shadow deal. So that's something to watch out for. In terms of your second question, in kind of our own governance and how that affects how the U.S.-China relationship will be pursued out of Washington. I mean, I kind of can't overstate kind of how problematic some of the State Department reorganization decisions are going to be in pursuing kind of an effective competitive strategy vis-a-vis China, as much as many of the people kind of with China in their title actually were preserved when so many of their colleagues were let go over the past few months. A lot of the technical experts or the thematic experts, the regional experts that were often at the heart of some of the policy-making conversations around how to deal with China are no longer there. So one of the examples that comes to mind is that the South China Sea team was fired from the State Department. So, yeah, you still have the officers, responsible, sitting at the embassy in Beijing, responsible for that issue. But if you don't have someone kind of looking at the regional policy on something like the South China Sea, that's really important for U.S.-China relations, but also important for U.S.-Philippines relations, U.S.-Vietnam, so many alliances kind of cut through that issue. When you don't have the human capacity to take that broader look at the question and it gets carved up into these different bilateral relationships, you could have real fragmentation of policy in ways that can be problematic for the allies and then also for stability in the U.S.-China relationship.
Tom, you're going to get the last word here.
Okay, so you first started talking about the international system and the international order. And I think it's hard for Americans right now to sell abroad in third countries, what is often the narrative in Washington and in the United States, that China is trying to revise the international system in its own image, or trying to revise it in a way that serves China's interests. Because the United States has kind of taken a hatchet to various institutions internationally in front of everybody else, and then complains about China's revisionist actions. So what that's done, I think, in terms of the U.S.-China strategic competition, is it has allowed China relatively effectively to portray itself as the conservative force in the international system that wants to bolster existing institutions and play by those rules and participate in multilateral trade negotiations in the region and around the world. and that the United States is a revisionist actor, which I don't think is really in the U.S. interest in the U.S.-China strategic competition to give China the opportunity to do that relatively effectively. And whether you agree with the premise or not, that China is revisionist, it's not conservative, doesn't really matter. What really matters is in third capitals what people think. And I think in third capitals, the United States is seen as quite revisionist, as rejecting a lot of the international institutions that the United States created, and China is seen as relatively moderate in comparison. And that's probably not in the U.S. competitive interests in competing for Chinese influence in those places. One of the things on economics, Scott, that you raised that I think we need to return to is China is very concerned about the 40% transshipment tariffs. It's very clear that they sent people to Europe or almost right away to try to convince Europeans not to apply them at home and to not help the United States police Chinese content in exports. I think it's going to be a big issue in places like Korea and Japan, and I think it's going to become an ongoing point of friction in U.S.-China bilateral economic relations. Is how is the United States treating third countries that are trade partners of China? Because as you know, when the 2018 tariffs went into effect on China, China increased its economic activity with third countries greatly, and the U.S. trade deficit with the world did not go down. We just imported a lot more from Vietnam, from Mexico, and elsewhere. The Trump administration is aware of that and is trying to do something about it. And that could really hurt the Chinese economy if it were effective. It's hard to imagine exactly how it would be executed in practice, the bureaucracies that would be involved and which countries would be involved. But if it were effectively leveled against Chinese transshipments in third countries, that would be very damaging to the Chinese economy. I think they know that and they want to prevent it. And the last two things I'd say, as you said, President Trump and his advisors, are there differences? I think since the Biden administration, Chinese diplomats have been trying to emphasize that there are worker bees or senior officials within the U.S. government who have a hawkish view of China, who are not in agreement with the president. So during the Biden administration, they used to always say, this is not in the spirit of San Francisco, or this is not in the spirit of an agreement that President Xi had with President Biden. Why are you being so hawkish? Why are you being so tough? Why don't you follow the lead of your president, right? And I think that that's likely to happen consistently until they get evidence to the contrary that it wouldn't work. And I expect them, the more hawkish advisors, to be countered by Chinese counterparts publicly or directly in bilateral discussions with the statement that, well, President Trump and President Xi seem to be getting along very well, and we shouldn't have any tension. The last thing I want to say is about Taiwan. If I were a Chinese nationalist who wanted Taiwan unification, not just preventing Taiwan independence, but wanting unification, it might be seen as a time to press the United States on Taiwan simply because we have in the Trump 2.0 administration, an administration that's unusual in American history in that it's not emphasizing democracy. So I mentioned 2020 and Trump 1.0. I think ideology was very important at that time. And I think the American officials working for President Trump really believed in the difference between democracy and the Chinese Communist Party, and were probably much more supportive of Taiwan for that reason. But I don't see in the current version of the Trump administration a real placing of real weight on the need to protect Taiwan's democracy against pressure from a non-democratic state. There might be strategic reasons in their mind, but I don't see that aspect. So if I'm a Chinese nationalist who wants unification, I might push really hard on this version of the American presidency to say, here's our chance to make progress from our perspective on pressuring Taiwan into some kind of agreement with us and pressuring the United States to allow such pressure on Taiwan to work, because this administration doesn't seem particularly focused on protecting democracies against authoritarian regimes. And they might be able to harken back to earlier this year when the United States was being very tough on Ukraine during the Russian invasion. Now that's changed. And I don't know how that's going to play out over time, but you have an administration that is not necessarily going to side with the Democratic side in a conflict.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank all four of you, Bonnie, Henrietta, Ilaria, Tom. It does seem like the Chinese are going to be asking for the moon, and it's possible the Trump administration will give them some lunar rocks, but it's also possible that we won't get a big deal or even a small deal. And but we're all going to have to be paying attention, and you all helped give the audience a very clear idea of what they should be looking for. I'll also mention that several of us at CSIS have written a commentary that was issued earlier today, a preview of a potential meeting and what might be on the table. And so whether you want to watch this program or read what we've written, you can all find that at both of those at csis.org. Thank you all for contributing today, and thanks everyone for joining. We'll be following these issues along with everybody in the days and weeks ahead. Thanks so much.